failure of the mainstream to understand what's actually happening. We had this false narrative all year about how strong the U.S. economy was, how strong the labor market was. And despite the fact that Trump was elected by people who expressed their concerns about how weak the economy was, the number one issue in the election was the economy because it was weak and inflation because it was strong. And people still don't get the predicament that we're in. We have a weak economy. The only thing that's strong is inflation. And that's the other thing that surprises me again, or maybe it doesn't surprise me, but that people don't understand that the Fed has lost the inflation war, that it didn't win, it surrendered. And that far from, or rather than moving back down to 2%, that inflation is headed back up to 9%. In fact, it's going to get higher next time. So we've got the worst of both worlds coming, much higher inflation, a much weaker economy. And electing Donald Trump, unfortunately, is not going to change that. The Fed hasn't handled anything appropriately. Maybe if you go back to Paul Volcker, but prior to that or subsequent to Volcker, I don't think they've handled anything appropriately. I think that's why we're in the dire circumstances that we are in, is because of how inappropriate Fed policy has been, including the current policy. I mean, the Fed made a mistake in lowering rates to zero. It never should have lowered them to zero even before COVID, but it made a bigger mistake bringing them there after COVID. The Fed never should have done any quantitative easing, going back to the first time I did it in 2009. It's been one mistake after another. The Fed shouldn't have lowered rates to 1% and helped inflate the housing bubble. So the mistakes have been going on ever since Greenspan was the Fed chairman, unfortunately. And, it hasn't gotten any better. Rates are still too low. The Fed never should have stopped hiking. They never got into restrictive territory. Despite the fact that they claim rates are restrictive, they're not restrictive in a sense that they're stopping the borrowing. The borrowing and spending has continued unabated by the public sector and the private sector. The savings rates have collapsed. The purpose of higher rates is to discourage borrowing and to encourage savings. But none of that has been achieved because the Fed stopped too soon. And so we continue to go deeper and deeper into debt, despite the fact that the Fed has hiked rates. And now the Fed is cutting rates. So they're pouring gasoline on the fire that they lit. Well, it's been a good year for gold. Gold has pared its gains a bit in dollars since Trump was elected, although it's gone on to make new record highs in other currencies. The Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar, the euro, the pound. We've seen record high gold prices after Trump was elected. And that's because, the dollar has benefited from a lot of the false optimism surrounding the U.S. economy and how it's going to fare relative to the rest of the world based on Trump. And I think if the world didn't have so much false optimism, I think the gold price would be, quite a bit higher than it is now. Probably, maybe $200-300 an ounce higher than it is. I think we're going to get there. I think it's just going to take a little while for the illusion to fade and for people to wake up to the reality of the problem. Well, they could move in the same direction. I just think gold will move a lot faster. So in real terms, the S&P will be going down. Look, the U.S. stock market, no matter how you look at it, is very overvalued. Now, the only way it's not overvalued is if you say, well, the dollar is going to crash. And so, priced in what the dollar is going to be worth in the future, maybe it's not overvalued, which could certainly be the case. But in terms of gold, in terms of how many ounces of gold you need to buy the S&P versus what the earnings are of the S&P in gold. So how many ounces of gold is the S&P earning right now versus the price of the S&P in gold? The PE is much too high, based on where it historically would be. And so I think that real U.S. stock prices are coming way down. What happens to nominal prices is harder to say, and I think even less relevant, because what matters to investors is not what their stocks are worth on paper, but what the value of those stocks will buy you in the real world. Gold has been rising against the S&P for 25 years. Gold has beaten the S&P for 25 years. So that's not true. Now, the cost of mining has gone up a lot as well. So that has reduced somewhat, or substantially in a way, the gains that gold mining companies have had from a higher gold price because they've also had a higher production cost. But recently, that's kind of turned around. We've seen production costs falling with the price of gold continuing to rise. So I think that ultimately that's going to really play well into margins for these companies. But if you look at the PE of these stocks, like look at Newmont Mining, it's at a PE of 12.5, and Barrick Gold, it has a PE of 12.8. These are ridiculously low valuations for these stocks when you have a S&P trading, closer to a 30 PE. Historically, Newmont and Barrick trade at premiums to the S&P, not huge discounts. So the main reason I think that gold stocks are still this cheap has to do with investor confidence or lack of it. I just don't think there's any interest in buying these stocks. And so they're very cheap because nobody wants them. People would rather buy the S&P. They would rather buy tech stocks. They would rather buy Bitcoin. And so there's very little investor demand right now for these gold stocks, despite the fact that their business models are working and they're a lot more profitable than they were a few years ago. But if investors don't care about the profitability and they don't share an optimistic outlook for the future price of gold because they just think gold's going to crash for whatever reason, even though it's been steadily increasing for 25 years, it's been climbing a wall of worry. The expectation has always been that the price of gold is going down, not up. And it keeps confounding expectations by rising anyway. And so that's really why gold stocks are cheap. I mean, because I think investors have got it wrong and they're being mispriced. But that's the opportunity in the sector. You buy the stocks when nobody wants them, and you hold them until everybody does, and then you can sell them at a much higher price. So that's what I've been doing. I've been holding them for a long time, waiting for people to figure this out. It's taking them longer than I thought to come to the correct conclusion. But the longer it takes, the higher the price is going to be when they finally figure it out. And so the more money that I'll make, I think, and the more money that people who are doing the same thing. So, I've got a fund, the Euro Pacific Gold Fund, which, I would encourage people to own. You can buy it no load at Schwab Fidelity. You got to buy the no load class, or you can contact my guys at Euro Pacific Asset Management. We also have separately managed accounts in gold stocks. I think these are going to be the 50, 100 baggers. I think, the junior mining sector is completely unloved and as cheap as it's ever been. If you buy the right stocks, I think you can really hit it out of the park. But you got to be willing to take the risk. There's no guarantees, especially when you're mining for gold. But I don't think it's a danger to gold. In fact, if anything, it may ultimately help gold because of all the money wasted on Bitcoin. It contributes to inflation. It contributes to making an economy less competitive and less productive. If we waste all of our money on Bitcoin and figuring out how to trade Bitcoin and mine Bitcoin and whatever, those are resources that can't be invested productively to produce things that people actually need and they actually want. And so Bitcoin is probably good for gold. It's bad for the people who buy Bitcoin because they could have bought gold instead. Now, I know, yes, the people who bought Bitcoin years ago instead of gold have made a lot more money on paper. The problem is most people who bought Bitcoin are not selling any of their Bitcoin because they think it's going to keep going up indefinitely. And so they haven't actually realized any of those gains. The smart people are selling. They're the ones that bought, 10 years ago, at a much lower price. And yeah, they're cashing out. They're laughing all the way to the bank. But the hodl gang is going to be left holding the bag. I think the main reason that Donald Trump embraced crypto was to get the votes of the crypto community, especially young people who typically vote Democrat. Now they had a reason to vote Republican because the Republican candidate was promising to make them rich. And so he got a lot of votes, but he also got a lot of campaign donations that he needed from the crypto industry. And so what he's doing now is paying back those donors by promoting Bitcoin and talking positively about a Bitcoin reserve so that the people who donated to his campaign can cash in on that investment by selling Bitcoin into all this hype. Now, whether or not he actually follows through with a Bitcoin reserve, which really to me is an act of treason. I think it's a terrible thing to do to the country, to reward a handful of crypto buyers at the expense of the entire country by wasting money, by going into debt to buy nothing. So I really hope that Trump doesn't do this. I think that the Loomis bill is going nowhere. I don't think there's any support for that bill outside of maybe a handful of people in the House or the Senate. So I think the only way there's a Bitcoin reserve is if Trump does it on his own by some kind of executive order, if that's even constitutional. But I hope that that doesn't happen. I mean, like, I've got no problem if people want to buy Bitcoin. I mean, I think it's a foolish thing to do. I think it's a digital pyramid scheme, a blockchain letter. I think a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money, and I think it's bad for society that we're squandering this money. But, it's a free country, supposedly. You're free to squander your money.